first of the second Harvard Symposia on Architecture series, the first event in that series. This year convened in collaboration with Antoine Picone. You'll recall last year with Erica, we had the return of nature. This year, the eclipse of beauty. The intention of the series is to bring together scholars and architects to discuss topics of importance in contemporary architectural culture broadly. Today, just to comment a little bit about what we were thinking when we began with this conference, a few thoughts. For many architects and academics, the idea of beauty is no longer applies to architecture. It is either too strongly associated with things like Renaissance beauty, or with Romanticism, the picturesque, or other pre-20th century modern aesthetics. Renaissance beauty, canonized in the 20th century by Rudolf Wittkower, was invested in harmonic proportions, intricate relationships of ratios, rules, idealizations too remote from the empiricism which has taken hold of architectural discourse and which has recently overwhelmed beauty, and seemingly once and for all, with the rallying cries for the intuitive, the embodied experience, material effects, environmentalism, etc., as opposed to principles, mental constructs, in other words, as opposed to form. Meanwhile, after the dogmatism of the Beaux-Arts and later the Bauhaus, the whole idea of foundations, the mathematics of the ideal anything, have become all but impossible to sustain. We have pluralism, many languages, dialects, signature styles, and none of the consensus required to think or criticize rigorously enough to speak of beauty, and none of the beliefs or values to motivate the aspiration to achieve it. And yet, in the past 20 years, we have witnessed developments that we might call revolutionary, which have begged the problem of beauty to return to the fore. Probably the most conspicuous being the digital medium, about which we will discuss tonight. The computer invokes efficiency, performance, optimization, extremes that, if not determinative of beauty, nevertheless point to virtuousness. Economy of means as an aesthetic value and functionalism, though denied, seem to be lurking. We speak of the instrumental capacity to bring about organizations. We think we're getting rid of the formal baggage of architecture. Functionalism seems too regressive to bring back, too obsolete, too much part of the obsolete 20th century modern dogmatism. Beauty seems frivolous, decadent, or worse, to return us to a certain kind of elitism, the aristocratic heritage that we thought functionalism had eclipsed. Meanwhile, despite the current ethos, taste and connoisseurship flourish, particularly here in the academy, where the bias favoring certain forms and styles, minimal, abstract, or computationally excessive, exclude the bad taste of things like the historicism of postmodernism, which for us is too often favored by a wider audience out there. Elite and populist alike. Case in point right here at Harvard, Bob Stern's business and law schools versus his museum in Harlem, the African American Culture Museum. The denial of taste and advocacy of the performative allows critics to maintain control over a very limited, and I dare say elite culture of forms. And in this environment, beauty stays under the radar. Among the aims of the conference, therefore, is to reveal the hidden motives, to disclose the criteria of judgment, and ultimately to challenge those who use arguments to deny their allegiance to forms and styles, in order that we may raise the critical stakes. And tonight we will do it by looking squarely at parametric design. And as you know, we do that because there are quite a number of people who populate the schools, participate in formidable conferences like the Acadia Conference, now an annual event, who are advocates heralding the dawn of a new era in which we can produce countless technically optimal solutions to our problems, even while in architecture, the effects are really not so much having to do with the technical production process from the point of view of the aesthetic. They have more to do with a kind of new style which is dominating, which has so much to do now with periodic gradient patterns of growth and change and all sorts of other curving things. The parametric, by enabling these and associating them with performative claims, has gained a great deal of traction among us. There will be much more to be said about all of this, but without any further ado, I'm going to introduce the first of our three speakers tonight, and that will be Mario Carpo. From Italy, where from the University of Florence he received his degree in architecture, and from European University Institute he holds his doctorate. He has taught extensively internationally, including in such places as the University of Geneva, Cornell, MIT, Yale. Now he is at Georgia Tech. He was a scholar in residence at Getty Research Institute and at the American Academy in Rome. As well, he was the head of the study center at the CCA. He has published extensively on Renaissance architectural theory, history, and culture, as well as digital technologies. The books Architecture in the Age of Printing, The Alphabet and the Algorithm are exemplary for setting the stage for the re-theorization of mediated representations and textual embodiments of architecture as a heuristic device. I'm very pleased that he could come and speak to us. The topics that he works on are so central to our interests here tonight. So please join me in welcoming Mario Carpo.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott, for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you to the audience. Can you hear my voice? Good. Is this the first slide of my PowerPoint? Meaning, is my PowerPoint already on? Well, let's try. No. Can someone put my PowerPoint on? Where is it? This is it? Yes, it is. This is the first slide. Thank you. So, I was given an assignment and a very tall order to discuss parametricism and beauty in 20 minutes, which will oblige me to narrow down the subject a little bit and to state from the start what I can and shall not discuss. I shall not discuss specific problems of digital form making, such as curvilinearity, angularity, exuberance, elegance, or minimalism, if there is a digital minimalism, which I doubt. I shall not discuss more general problems of digital poetics, as indeed there is a poetics of digitality. But again, this is not our topic today, or rather tonight. I shall not discuss subjects, although some may argue that beauty may have something to do with them. I shall only discuss objects, and in fact only one specific class of objects. Not natural objects, but human-made objects. Objects of design. And this for a number of reasons, but first and foremost because in the digital world, human-made objects are no longer what they used to be. Parametricism has changed the way we make objects. Consequently, what we make with them and what we make of them. A philosopher would say that parametricism has changed the ontology as well as the axiology of objects. A non-philosopher could also say that parametricism has changed what objects are and the value we confer upon them, including their market value and the price we are ready to pay for them. And this applies to all parametrically manufactured objects, to objets d'art, as well as to objects of daily use, to media objects, such as text, images, or music, as well as to physical objects, such as chairs, buildings, or automobiles. For the last few centuries, and until recently, we had two ways of making objects: hand-making and mechanical machine-making. Objects that are made by hand, handmade objects, tend to be visually different from one another, even when they are serially reproduced, because that is the way free hand-making and free unconstrained human bodies work. Think of a signature. No two signatures made by the same hand are identical, even though all signatures made by the same person are expected to be similar. Otherwise, they could not be recognized. Then came mechanical machines. Mechanical machines use casts, molds, stamps, or matrices, and all imprints of the same matrix are the same. But mechanical matrices are expensive to make, and once made, their cost must be amortized by using them as many times as possible. This is the world of mass production, economies of scale, and standardization. At its core, this is the technical logic of industrial modernity. This is what I have in mind. Stamps, casts, or molds. But digital making does not work that way. Digital notations are in a permanent state of drift, and they can change all the time, randomly, automatically, or by the intervention of some external unpredictable agency. Indeed, digital scripts are increasingly designed for variability or open-endedness right from the start. And digital fabrication, in most cases, does not use mechanical matrices. Hence, in a non-standard series, variation can be mass-produced in theory, and I underline in theory, at no extra cost. These are not buildings. These are columns. It's called the Column Museum, but the logic is the same. In short, in a digital design and fabrication chain, product standardization is technically and culturally irrelevant. And in a digital design environment, modern authorship is replaced by some new format of hybrid or participatory agency, a joint venture of sorts among any combination of human and technical actors and networks. Now, whether we like it or not, this hybridization of agency is an essential aspect of digital parametricism because it is embedded in its very technical nature. Let's not forget the original mathematical meaning of parametricism. A parametric function is a function where some parameters are deliberately left indeterminate. Only the limits of their variations are set. Within these limits, anything goes. An open-ended parametric notation can be fixed or finalized by the same person who wrote it, but also by someone else, or by something else, and or it may evolve all alone, or almost. It can emerge, adapt, self-organize, even. The possibilities are infinite, but most of them are outside the control of the author of the original script. A parametric function is an open-ended algorithm. It is a generative, incomplete notation. At the beginning of the digital turn, Gilles Deleuze and Bernard Cache invented a special term to define this new kind of technical object. They called it an objectile, which perhaps in English reads an objectile. In philosophical terms, an objectile is a generic object. It is a general script that defines an open-ended class of individuals, of individual or specific objects, which will all be different as individuals, but also all similar, as they all have something in common. What they have in common is the code or script that was used to make them, and which is, in a sense, embedded in them. The morphogenetic metaphor in this theory is as evident as is its Aristotelian and scholastic provenance. Let's think in Aristotelian terms of genus and species, universal and singular, form and event. In our case, in parametric design, the script is the genus, and the individual object is the species. The script is the definition, and the class of events it creates is the extension. Now, interestingly, scholasticism has already been famously related to one architectural style. Gottfried Semper was famously the first to define the Gothic as petrified scholasticism, which the great classicist did not mean as a compliment. With different nuances, the notion was taken over by Wilhelm Wöhringer and many others, and is today a commonplace. In 1951, Erwin Panofsky outlined several types of isomorphism between Gothic architecture and scholasticism. Now, I don't know what a rose is doing in the middle of this. Yes, the rose is over a rose window, over a roses. That's charming. I don't think it was Panofsky's idea, because Panofsky's plan here was first and foremost to emphasize that the Gothic and scholasticism have something important in common. Both the Gothic and the scholastic mind cherished the intricacy of articulation. For example, in logic, an arborescence or a tree of definitions and divisions. And each Gothic or scholastic articulation is a game of variations within the same class. For example, all capitals at the same level in the nave of the same Gothic cathedral are generally similar, but seldom identical. Now, does this ring a bell? The analogies between the Gothic, scholasticism, and today's parametricism are vast and wide-ranging, and are not limited to form or style. Participatory, collective, and often anonymous making, that mantra of the Web 2.0 or Web 2.0, well, that was the rule on most medieval building sites, even though medieval builders could not call it that way because the modern idea of individual authorship did not yet exist at the time. As Lars Spuibroek, a contemporary, not a medieval man, is one of today. As Lars Puisbroek eloquently pointed out, today's parametricism is indeed, in many ways, a revival of the Gothic revival, or a Gothic revival, or a Gothic revival to the power of 2, or a John Ruskin 2.0. Yet, equally interestingly, another pioneer of a digital turn, the already mentioned Bernard Cash, has recently concluded a thorough investigation of Vitruvius's design method and proven with compelling arguments that the method of Vitruvius was also quintessentially parametric. This is just a visualization. The actual computational system in Vitruvius to design the orders is inconceivably more complicated and way more rich than it appears in this diagram. An almost mind-boggling game of variations within a single class. Yet, Vitruvius was no Gothic. The game here is a bit different, because in classical architecture, in a Greek temple, for example, most capitals in the same row, in the same building, are often quite identical to one another. But all Doric capitals manufactured following the instructions that Vitruvius outlines in his book 4, for example, can only be once again similar but not identical to one another. They all belong to the same class. They are all defined as Doric capitals, and they can be visually recognized as such. But the algorithmic design process of Vitruvius does not control the final finished shape of each individual Doric capital. Each maker will need to choose or add something at will, but at the same time in compliance with Vitruvius's rules. Based on this evidence, one would be tempted to conclude that all pre-mechanical theories of manufacturing, classic or Doric or Gothic regardless, are bound to be parametric, just as most post-mechanical digital theories of manufacturing are today. Evidently, hand-produced variations are slower to make and fewer in number than those we can mass-produce today using digital tools. But exception made for speed and performance and a few other details, both hand-making and digital making can produce designed variations because both can follow rule-based generative scripts, either alphabetic or algorithmic, based on text or on computation, logocentric or logicocentric. But this is the opposite of mechanical making, which, again, as in this case, mostly reproduces identical copies of archetypal visual models using mechanical stamps, casts, or molds.
Excuse me.
Yes, what's happening?
Just
Was it falling?
I'm sorry?
Was it falling?
No, it wasn't picking you up when you were talking.
Oh, okay, thanks. Can you hear me again? Should I restart from the beginning? Well, let's hope not. It will take more than 20 minutes. Now, this parallel between hand making and digital making, or between the alphabet and the algorithm, may look like a truism, too evident to be meaningful. But if it is true, its consequences, including aesthetic consequences, are staggering. For it appears that we are now moving out of a visual universe populated by exactly repeatable visual imprints. Think indeed of a printed page, or think of that which is on the screen. It gives the idea somehow. And into a new world generated by exactly transmissible but endlessly open-ended invisible algorithms, either designed for change, customization, or evolution, or not, but then often tweaked and changed all the same. In this new world, objects and their outward and visible forms are only the occasional and ephemeral epiphany of a script embedded in them, of which every manifestation can be different, randomly, or automatically, or by design, or by the design of some random human agent, which is probably the worst case of all. In the mechanical age, our apprehension of human-made objects used to be based on the identification of identical copies. In a world of mechanical prints, either one visual form is identical to another, and then it has the same meaning, or it is different, and then it has another meaning or no meaning at all. In a parametric environment, on the contrary, identification is not based on identicality, but on similarity and on resemblance, just like in nature, where the reproduction of similarities is the rule. Think of a son that looks somehow like his father. Many examples come to mind. But in nature, identical copies are the exception. Think of two identical monozygotic twins, which in nature are a very extraordinary case. In the old mechanical world, iconic and indexical signs were particularly powerful because both were predicated upon immediate visual identification, on our capacity to relate the copy to the original, which it reproduced. In the new parametric world, only some form of social consensus can bestow some conventional meaning upon endlessly variable visual signs. Charles Sanders Peirce, the philosopher, famously called this class of signs symbols. And once again, not coincidentally, symbolic meaning was powerful in pre-mechanical times, and particularly in the Middle Ages, when only society at large could attach stable meaning to unstable signs. In his famous study of medieval imitation, Richard Krautheimer tried to account for the medieval capacity to identify objects of all sorts and shapes as equally valid copies of the same model. For example, the Shrine of the Sepulchre in Jerusalem, of which the original is in Jerusalem, but of which each medieval city had one or more lookalikes. Except that not one of these lookalikes looked alike, as all copies were completely different from one another, and all different from the original, which, by the way, no one at the time had ever seen. Now, how can you imitate an original which you have never seen is a topic for another seminar. Krautheimer concluded, with some perplexity, that by our standards, by modern standards, medieval visuality appeared to be, I quote, almost emphatically non-visual. The same applies, and will increasingly apply, to today's postmodern visuality, born of a new digital and parametric environment. In a visual environment where visual forms can change so fast and so often, appearances will count for less and less, and our capacity to interpret them will count for more and more. The meaning of parametrically generated variable forms will be increasingly contingent upon our capacity to see them in context and to relate them to others, by comparison and selection, by generalization and abstraction, recognizing variations, inferring patterns, and sorting events into classes, choosing some, discarding others, and making some sense out of them, making cosmos out of chaos. In short, the beauty of parametricism is that by making our life more difficult, it will oblige us to become intelligent human beings once again. Thank you.
And now Ingeborg Rocker, Assistant Professor of Architecture here at the GSD, an architectural designer and theorist whose work involves research on and the use of parametric techniques. She holds a PhD from Princeton and architectural degrees from Columbia and RWTH Aachen, and she was a visiting scholar at Humboldt University. Prior to establishing her own practice with Christian Long, Rocker was the lead designer at Eisenman Architects of a number of well-known projects, including the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin, perhaps one of the best of his projects on the city in the period of the 90s. Currently, her projects extend the indexical formal approach that she worked on there by means of what she has called versioning, rather than by means of animistic iteration. And her practice focuses with this on installations, conceptual studies of computationally generated tectonic systems and components, design proposals for a diverse range of building types produced by both traditional and scripted techniques and a peculiar hybrid. This is a very interesting line of investigation, which seems to have also paralleled and emerged in part from her own PhD, entitled Evolving Structures, Information Aesthetics, and Architecture of the Digital Medium, which is a comprehensive study of the computational design since the end of World War II. It traces, interestingly, the origins of the long-standing opposition between scientific and artistic uses of the new medium, a division that is as operative today as it was in those early years, and one of the reasons it makes it so much part of the current debate. I should mention, by the way, that Inga is the author of numerous polemical essays, most recently in Log that just came out, apropos parametricism, if, in what style should we build? Perhaps she'll tell us tonight. Inga, welcome.
Okay, thanks Scott and Antoine for having me here. I didn't get an assignment, so therefore I chose my own assignment, and it's a little off maybe from what is expected, and I almost have the impression that I slipped in Mario's role, because I took on the question first, what is beauty? Because I couldn't think of the eclipse if I wouldn't know what we would eclipse. And so I was thinking first of beauty and then also about parametric design and the two in combination with each other. What is beauty? Why beauty? Why does parametric design eclipse beauty? In the past, beauty was associated with the divine, the metaphysical. Already early on, differentiations between the sensuous and the intelligible beauty is made. Platon and Plotin comprehend beauty as an idea, which the human is only capable of grasping through cognition. That which occurs as beautiful is beautiful as it is part of an ideal of beauty. This ideal of beauty equally extends to trees, humans, gods, as well as philosophical concepts. It is the form of being that differentiates beauty through order, dimension, and proportion from the formless, the ugly, and the chaotic. In medieval times, Platon's comprehension of beauty was taken up and contextualized in the Christian comprehension of the world. Hereby, beauty became directly linked to the splendor of Dei, to the shine and luminosity of God. Beauty was objective, as it was an attribute of God, an expression of his perfection. God was turned into the center and origin of harmonic order, of the beauty of everything created. Thomas von Aquin mentioned 3 criteria for beauty of natural and artistic creations: integrity and perfection, second, the proper proportion and coordinates of the parts to one and another, and third, splendor and clarity. The world's sensuous beauty was hereby not only a reminder of God's perfection, but it was also a direct image of God's perfection. In this sense, the beauty of the world was at once the realization of God and allowed for the realization of God through the human. Through the church sponsorship of the arts, the Christian ideology and the concept of beauty as an imago Dei was transported into the arts. The arts became the locus where perfection and harmony comparable to the found in nature was set forth. The Renaissance artist became the vehicle through which the divine perfection found its expression in and through beautiful artwork. God gave the artist a disegno interno, which the artist at first realized and then realized in the sense of a materialization. It was the genius of the artist which enabled him, guided through the divina idea della bellezza, to set forth the beauty that otherwise would remain hidden within the materiality at hand. Through selection, the artist manipulated the material surface to overcome any imperfection and to arrive at the original beauty of being. Any imperfection was overcome through the ideal artistic form characterized through unity, order, proportion, symmetry, and clarity. These characterizations of beauty will survive until the 18th century. During the Baroque and the Classicism, beauty will be associated with the mimesis of nature. The repetition of nature did not suggest the copying of nature. Rather, through the mimesis of nature, a realization of nature was set forth. The mimesis of nature's beautiful perfection had the goal to realize new insights about nature. Art had the role to displace the recipients of nature's beauty from his or her accustomed day-to-day comprehension of nature, of being. The goal was to arrive at an extraordinary pleasure linked to a new realization of nature's and an extension's being's beauty. The realization of beauty gained at this point a moral dimension. Realization of beauty in and through art became important aspects of any ethical and moral training. During the Enlightenment, beauty was reinterpreted as neither being based on metaphysics nor in the divine, but rather in the subjectivity of the human, in the creative and perceptive capacity of the subject. For Baumgarten, the founder of aesthetics, beauty was still the realization of the world's perfection as it shined forth in and through aesthetic realizations. The predicates of beauty were still perfection, order, proportion, harmony, and congruence of the parts. Nevertheless, the realization thereof was, according to Baumgarten, based on a subjective aesthetic judgment based on the subject's sensuous experience. With Kant, a Copernican turn is achieved in which beauty was detached from any divine or metaphysical objectivity. Beauty had no longer any a priori determined characteristica, but was instead linked to a subjective aesthetic judgment. This judgment was a peculiar judgment, as it was a realization based on the interplay between imagination and intellect. Key component to beauty was that it triggered a pleasure which was free of any goal, interest, and definition. Beauty allowed insights into a realm of the intelligible, which otherwise could never be realized through rationality. The capacity to realize beauty was consequently the capacity to enter a realm of intelligibility, which was hidden from the intellect otherwise. In modernity, throughout modernity, the term beauty became contested, as neither its former association with moral and ethical values founded in Christianity's belief systems, nor its association with subjective judgment seemed an appropriate reaction and assessment of modern production processes and life. The German art historian Konrad Fiedler argued, in reflection of the physiological research of Wund and Lips, that aesthetic experience is a sensuous realization, that the human realization of the world is relative to the kind of sensuous sensation, that kind of sensation through which reality was realized. What this means is text allowed for a textual, vision for a visual, hearing for an acoustical realization of reality. Consequently, any realization of reality was always relative, was always in relation to the sensory apparatus in and through which it took place. The reality as such remained fugitive and could only be accessed as a mediated reality, mediated through the senses. Perhaps we may then argue that beauty is precisely the realization of reality as always being fugitive. beauty could be argued is a setting force of reality as nothing but a fugitive realization in and through the sensuous apparatus. In this vein of thinking, new devices for mediating reality will also allow to set forth new realizations of reality. It is in this sense that any new media device allows for being, in the sense of a sensuous and intellectual realization, a peculiar insight into reality's modality, which is directly and solely linked to the media device at use. For example, through the introduction of microscopes, a new dimension of reality was set forth. Through the introduction of computers and their capacity to visualize data, new modalities of reality became accessible. The positivistic-oriented information aesthetic of Max Benzer tried to give aesthetic a scientific foundation, with the hope to calculate objectively beauty. The basic premise for Benzer's information aesthetic was that human perception is an information process in which reality is perceived as an ever-changing data pattern in and through which objects and subject emerge in the moment of their structuration, in the moment of their consolidation as a recognizable pattern. The measure of beauty Benzer hoped to calculate, nevertheless, took its clues in the past, when order, proportion, symmetry, and clarity were considered as being more beautiful than complexity and chaos. Benzer's information aesthetic defined as beautiful those structurations that displayed the greatest order, the greatest degree of information. Benzer's attempt to find an objective scientific foundation for aesthetics, ironically, was founded on an utterly subjective selection of criteria according to which the measure of beauty was objectively calculated. Beauty now, eclipsed. Finally, arriving at today's situation, beauty is rarely a subject of interest in the discussion and production of architecture. It has been successfully eclipsed. And yet, by claiming it as being eclipsed, Antoine and Scott make beauty and, in extension, aesthetics again a center of discussions. Why is that? Does the discussion of beauty today suggest a newly emerging desire for beauty, which goes beyond the naive obsession with cosmetics, beautiful skins, and surface patterns, but indicates a secret desire for orientation, for possibilities of judgment, but also for an alternative realization of reality that is based not only on cognition, but also on sensuous experiences? Is this in the case the revival of beauty discussion in if this is the case, the revival of the beauty discussion in architecture could be an attempt to reevaluate aesthetics in the sense of a judgment through sensuous sensation that will give insights into reality that would otherwise be impossible. Now, the eclipse of beauty has been linked to computation and more specifically to parametics. Why is that? Well, it could be suggested that most recent uses of computation, in particular the parametric approach in architecture, do eclipse beauty in the following sense. If we link the concept of beauty to the genius artist setting forth, letting shining forth the divine given beauty, obviously, parametric design, the automated generation of object families computed by a machine rather than by a genius artist or a genius architect, eclipsed beauty. If we link the concept of beauty to the subject's alternative access to reality based on sensuous sensation, parametric design and its automated evaluation may have eclipsed beauty as well. Nevertheless, if we link the concept of beauty to aesthetics as a sensuous sensation that always allows for an alternative realization of reality, parametric design may offer such alternative access to reality, and beauty is not eclipsed. Parametric design is being based on computation, and in fact, it may allow for a unique realization of reality that is literally informed by data processing, by computation. It may precisely be for this reason that parametric design does not eclipse beauty, but rather sets forth a new beauty. Beauty obviously can here not be seen in the classic sense of a divine given proportion, harmonies, and orders, but can rather be seen in and through an active setting forth of reality as it is literally informed through the logics of computation. These logics fundamentally challenge the concept of authorship, the role of the subject and the role of the object in the process of architecture production. And we have heard this already from Mario Carpo. And now I'm going to rapidly move through a project which illustrate that. That is our contribution to the Venice Biennale last year, and it's about a parametric design, which happened thanks to Matthew Waxman, Hiroshi Jacobs, Wes Thomas, Leslie McTagg, and others, and of course also thanks to the computer. So, and what I'm going through now is just quickly to show you this project, and it's both at once. It's a commentary, a criticism, and almost a cynic elaboration of parametrics and what it leads to if you let the machine run. Obviously, we were authoring how we wanted to let it run. Nevertheless, part of the polemic is here that we did not select anything. We have here rigidly set up a matrix, which we then operated through a couple of parameters. We're looking at towers here, which each of them follows a certain set of rules. Each of them has the same height. And I just show you what happened. So this is the underlying numerics for the towers. Here the separate towers, so you can see this is one line taking out of the matrix. You can see the different iterations. Again, each tower is a component of a series. There are infinite many possible interim steps. We just have chosen to select 5. So I'm not arguing that these towers are beautiful in the sense of beauty as we maybe naively think of. I argue that this type of project would allow us to comprehend the condition of the author and the object in different terms, and therefore it is beauty as it allows us to set forth a different understanding of reality and objecthood subject. So you may see here, sorry, I would maybe go back. The floor plans are really pitching out. They also, again, following a certain set of rules. You can see one unit is here reduced to just as bathroom, right? This is probably not very sensible in terms of an architecture project, but again, this is exemplifying how far one can go and maybe also how far one shouldn't go. By the way, thanks to Wes Thomas, all of those things have been automated in the output. So they were automatically placed on the page. We have a book produced, which is 450 pages thick, in which we exercise through each separate tower, each separate floor plate. You can get the picture. Now, those are elevations of the matrices. Five of them selected to be presented. They were manufactured here downstairs in the basement, the milling machine, and then assembled. Obviously, the configuration could become meaningful, but they have not been chosen to be meaningful at that point. But they can be any time the matrix could be better informed than it has been, let's say that. So the work of art and architecture is no longer comprehended as a unique work that is set forth by a genius artist, but rather as a series, as a framework of rules and parameters in and through which works of art and architecture may be computed. In this sense, parametric design allows to access a particular modality of reality as it is informed through computation. In how far today's parametric designs result in responsible, good architecture or urbanisms or landscapes remains questionable. Beauty, at least, as I have discussed it today, no longer aligns itself with neither an idealistic nor an ethical or a moral dimension. Beauty is an alternative mode of comprehension based on sensuous sensation, not more and not less. If this is enough of a motivation to produce architecture, I am rather doubtful. Recent parametric design have been obsessed with the possibilities of computation, nevertheless most often reduce its application to the creation of mere surface effects, at best symbolizing rather than taking advantage of the computer's power, the tireless looping, its ability to perform millions of operations in a single second and to constantly shift and recalculate functions. Many of the results are often grotesquely dysfunctional, uninhabitable, continuously differentiating spaces which were at best rigorously generated. In architecture, this development results in little more than an exhausting and now exhausted exuberance of form. The formal exuberance characteristic of parametism and urban planning scenarios, for example, those a la Patrick Schumacher, pretended to cope with the society's and life's complexity, while in fact they are at best expressions thereof, empty gestures of a formal obsession and strangely undercomplex approach to architecture and urbanity. Parametism taking to this end Sorry, I'm trying to forward something here, but it doesn't work. Okay. Parametism taken to this end is at the end. Parametism a la Schumacher incorporated in formal architecture and urbanism, which at best, if at all, might become a posteriori motivated and motivatable. Sorry, I'm missing here something. Is not an ambassador for paramatics. Saying this does not dismiss the concept of parametism altogether. Rather, it critiques the architectural processes and the resultant formalizations that so far take place in its name. How then can we, as architects, think of parametism as a new style of thinking that acknowledges life's complexity and that would finally allow us to comprehend ourselves, including our culture and biological productions, as part of one and the same ecological system? Now, I'm not talking about green here, green architecture. I'm talking about an eco-logic, which is something else. I think Michael and I may discuss that later. So parametism as a new mode of thinking ecological suggests that humans, like any other constituent component of the Earth's ecology, are continuously in exchange with one another and any other parameters constituting the system. Certainly, the philosophical construct of the human as different or even aloof from the very ecological system he stems from is a historical construct of Western civilizations that has proven to be a fatal miscomprehension, bringing the ecosystem Earth, including its human constituents, to the brink of their resources. As a new philosophical position, parametism may allow for a rethinking, may allow for a radical change in how we think and design our built environment. Finally, comprehending it as being a part of and never a part from the living ecological system we are living in and through is an important task. In this respect, I agree with Patrick Schumacher, who rightfully suggests, and I quote, parametism brings malleable components into a dynamic play of mutual responsiveness as well as contextual adaptation. Key design processes are variations and correlations. Computationally, any property, positional, geometric, material, or any architectural element can be associated with made the cause of, or effect of any other property of any other element of the design. The designer invents and formulates correlations or rules akin to the laws of nature. Thus, everything is potentially made to network and resonate with everything else. This should result in an overall intensification of relationships that gives the urban field a performative density. Indeed, the general paradigm of ecosystems applies to both and is embraced as a foundation paradigm of parametism, end of quote. Obviously, computers will be used in order to arrive at a design methodology that takes into account the complexities of reality. Nevertheless, architects and urban planners must organize the parameters they choose to lawfully differentiate and correlate all elements and subsystems of a design. Only if architecture and urbanism are viewed from more than one, currently the formal, vantage point, Only if sociopolitical as well as technological, material, and organizational aspects are taken into equation, we will have a successful parametric approach. And it's only then that parametism will be able to achieve those changes to our modes of thinking, designing and producing the architecture and urbanity that Schumacher hopes for. Only then we may speak of parametism as a new style of living, a new style of working, a new style of comprehending ourselves and the ecology we are part of. It seems that only then will parametism have matured enough to become the first true challenge to the modern conception of beauty, of modern man, modern inhabitation, modern work logics and ethics, modern architecture, modern urbanism, and modern exploitations of the planet. It is then that parametism does not cause the eclipse of beauty, but rather sets forth a beauty, in the sense of an alternative insight into reality. Thank you.
Okay. And finally, Michael Meredith, partner and co-founder with Hilary Sample of MOS, a firm producing an unusually wide range of projects, which in remarkably diverse ways are parametric in conception, in technical terms, or in both. Associate professor here at the GSD, though on leave this year, he is the author of numerous articles in contemporary architecture, author of projects widely published, exhibited, and awarded. His projects are multidisciplinary at the deep level of architecture, from scenarios arising in houses for well-known artists and intellectuals with new arrangements for accommodating exceptional modes of working within domestic space, to his designs of buildings with particular social protocols, such as museums, factories, nonprofit institutions, and including collaborations with artists, engineers, manufacturers, and software scriptwriters, such as in his many installations in cultural institutions, his films, product designs, and furniture. The breadth is quite extensive. But it is the material treatment of the parametric, of its elastic potential, that I wanted to say something about very quickly, just to note something, which is that he works against it in such an extreme way. Look at the way, for example, the parametrically conceived PS1 project turns out to be clad in what he calls wet dog fur. Or think about the way that he brings moss, not the MOS of the name of his firm, but the real stuff, to the puppet theater that he built here. He then goes on in recent work to imbue this elasticity with a very different characteristic. He ends up turning it into discrete elements, piles them up. He imbues forms with forces, using the logic of engineering against architecture to generate what could only be called parametrical madness. So, you can see that in the piles and the many installations on that problem. This is a new kind of architecture without an architect. It's both computational and tectonic. It's forms falling into place by means of structural metrics, but not in any way having to do with the optimization that we were referring to earlier that Inga, I think, was talking about. Anyway, as he is one of the only who works both with and against the parametric, I really had to ask him to join us tonight. Welcome.
It's a nice introduction. So that's, I hope you can't see my password. Okay. Can we get the lights too, maybe a little bit? It seems more dramatic. I'm going to keep it, I think, hopefully relatively brief to the point. I have the luxury of being asked relatively late to do this, and in a way replace Patrick Schumacher. So I really quickly felt like it was necessary to deal with him, who's sort of lurking around in the room, and got the books and watched the movie, and tried to figure it out. And I have a few responses. In a way, the book, I have to say, is, I think, I can't really pronounce it, Autopoiesis of Architecture, I think, is both amazingly generous in a certain sense and also has amazing hubris. And I think I don't totally disagree with a lot of it. Is quite compelling, and a lot of it, I think, at a very fundamental level is wrong. So I'm going to try to respond in 4 points if I can, as opposed to 20-something. Okay, number 1. Parametricism equals positivism and expressionism. This will make your job really easy because I have most of it up on the screen. So, parametricism. Positivism in its tautological construction espouses a scientific method of architecture. Its inheritance from previous avant-garde models, early modernism. It utilizes the logics of mathematical mechanisms to avoid problems of composition, artistic expression, and to dismantle the architectural object. Expressionism in the kind of Mendelssohn sense, in Franz Klein painterly sense of gesture, line, illusionary space, sculptural artistic effects, hyperbolic effects. And in parametricism, what I think were once ideological opposites are now happily neutered. I don't know if this is a criticism or not, but it seems like that's the case. But what does it mean if you can produce Chopin through an algorithm, I would say? And what does it mean if everything coexists in a slick, smooth relationship? Point number 2, and this is something in a way I kind of agree. I think Schumacher and I would agree, and even way Scott, his introduction, is the discipline is in a kind of state of disarray. It seems like maybe it's perpetual disarray, but it seems pretty bad at the moment. And in a sort of the discipline as it implies a shared knowledge and set of values in order to evaluate and analyze work. The value system allows for this autonomy, which is the discipline at the core of architecture. It's social autonomy, not formal. Architecture is primarily is us talking about and to objects and to each other about what architecture should be or could be. And it's the constant questioning of values of beauty, of better and worse, of well-built, of useful, of interesting and appropriate. The values are not absolute. They're in constant debate. And we, especially in schools, are responsible for providing this leadership both in establishing and questioning these schools, which I don't think we're doing a great job of, frankly. So the way exhibit I have here is kind of a personal, and in fact a lot of this stuff is very personal and provincial at some level, but this is kind of my take on architecture from the 90s and the noughties. I call it so 1990 to 2000, which is, I started in 1990 in first year architecture school, graduated from here in 2000, and then 2000, 2010, the noughties, was teaching and was practicing architect. So in the 90s, what was important was representational projects. It was the end of history. It was process-driven methodologies to avoid postmodern semiotics. It was internal disciplinary avant-garde. It was theory. It was critical. It was geometry. It was complexity. It was formal. It was non-materiality. It was Maya or Alias and Max and Rhino. It was plans, sections, process drawings, lots of lines. Palimpsest was a horrible word that was used a lot. Aesthetic project. It was all the advanced architects that we all looked up to were not licensed. They were not professionals. They were academics. And the magazines that you wanted to be published in were the ones that explained ideas. It was like Assemblage and Any. And in that pendulum swung, I would say, in the noughties to the other side, where it was about realism. It was the end of representation. It was the value system of the 90s got so overwrought and confusing and mystical through theory to some degree that you couldn't evaluate it anymore, and it was much easier to evaluate work if it was built or wasn't built. I mean, that became a clear metric. It was the arms race that we talk about. It was about engaged in the world, opportunistic, rearguard, practical. It was physics. There was no celebrity engineers in the 90s that I know of. And in a way, like not like there was in the noughties. And it was functional, sustainable. It was materiality. It was, quantifiable sort of software, BIM, Revit, CATIA, Ecotech. It was diagrams, the diagram sort of, that's a whole other lecture, but arrows, a photorealistic rendering and a working drawing. That was pretty much how you understood architecture. It was urban as opposed to about sort of the social. And all my friends and I made an effort to get licensed. I think it was, I consider us like a kind of the practice generation of sorts out there to be practicing architects. And the magazines you wanted to be published in were ones that you could get more work from. Okay. So point number 3, that was sort of a description of how the discipline sort of is a kind of variable beast. The unifying singular style, which is what I'm interested in, this idea that parametric as a style, not so much as a philosophical or historical thing, is an ontological impossibility. I think if the myth of modernism was that it operated at scale across multiple registers, multiple disciplines, as a search for unprecedented unity via the zeitgeist, and that in its own right is a horrible thing that's been undone in art and architectural history for decades now. And if postmodernism was the relinquishing of the aspiration of utopian unification, instead instrumentalizing fragmentation, then where we are now is something else. We no longer lament the loss of a whole, the idea of architecture. We rather occupy parallel ontologies. We occupy multiple simultaneous subjectivities. We're in foams, niches, networks, perhaps due to the ubiquity of social media, et cetera. In architectural terms, though, this means we've been witnessing the genreification of architecture and the loss of a clear dominant style. The demise of architectural discipline, as suggested in point number 2, is due to the loss of a clear medium specificity. Medium specificity, as I'm presenting, is the datum in which we produce, analyze, conceptualize, discuss architecture. Sort of like orthographic projection would be one example as a kind of medium specificity, and structure could be another. And these are things from, as you can tell, from studios I've taught here, so it's not really probably all new to a lot of students here. Today, even with the autonomy of our so-called discipline, everything has evolved into an archipelago of different positions, I would say. The digital freaks, nerdy geometers, I put the exclamation point for Scott. The automated techno-utopians, the conceptual ephemeralists, the brooding materialists, autistic formalists, slick programmists, humorless neo-pragmatists, DIYers, activists, do-gooders, cartoon hipsters, sustainable opportunists, etc. Each of these niches and spheres have their own enthusiasts, their own vocabularies, their own value systems, and their own utopian desires. Basically, there is no stable or cohesive construction of the social to allow for a singular discourse or a unifying style at this moment. It's too small, but that's a map of kind of the genreification. Okay, so number 4, and this is where it's a little bit longer, but this is about the aesthetics, and I kind of address Patrick and Inge a little bit here, as Inge suggested. As noted in point number 3, parametricism as a unifying style for the discipline is a contemporary impossibility, but regardless, there remains a question of whether or not it's a worthwhile ambition to begin with. So in the 21 text, which I think is a really interesting issue, I think Patrick's and Inge's texts are an interesting sort of parallel discourse to have next to each other. In that text, Inge questions the parametricism of politics, that it only operates formally and does not operate how we live or work or ecologically. And the lament is that, which is really interesting, I didn't even know Schumacher was a kind of self-professed communist, is that the brand of parametricism cannot produce the communism that Schumacher says he prefers, instead that he's only left to reiterate capitalist development. One of the concerns I have with the point, though, is that it assumes that for architecture to be political, it needs to directly engage politics, suggesting that formalism is not political. It's not enough. And so what I would like to say is architecture operates politically through its aesthetics. It's actually, to explain this, I'd like to use the cliche analogy of architecture as quote-unquote music, which Goethe wrote about and is repeated ad nausea, that you learn even before you come into architecture school. And I do believe that music, I'm maybe more sensitive to it than most, but I believe that it is our most advanced and sublimated aesthetic project in America. Students have an incredible knowledge and index of musicians. They know exactly what it all means. They can argue for them which songs or which things are better or worse. Anyways, but as architects, like musicians and bands, produce aesthetics, momentary subjectivity, social and political space. Some make ethnic folk tunes, some works on. Some, I realize I have a lot of lists with commas. I got to stop that. Some prefer rave music, some ambient, techno virtuosity, some like lyrics, etc. Grandeur. Each genre has its own enthusiasts that care deeply about the material, that feels enfranchised or liberated by it. For these groups, a particular music feels right or interesting, and as a result, they momentarily believe their music to be better, more pleasurable, more complex, more meaningful than other music. This aesthetic quality of music produces identity and political constituencies. An example of what Jacques Rancière, who's kind of, this is basically a reworking of Rancière, identifies as art's ability to constitute a new collective world through the production of its own politics. Architecture, like music, is ontological. It produces one group that says turn it up and another says turn it down, that sounds horrible, that doesn't sound like music. These produced subjectivities are fleeting, and an architecture like music is momentary, produced only to be eventually replaced. As an example, and although it's incredibly popular, I'm uninterested in most techno music. The techno is the aesthetic equivalent to the parametric for me. For Patrick, the parametric is a dream of total control and expressionism achieved through positivist logic and repetition. In our office, we use the same techniques of the parametric towards an experimentalism to help produce noise, mistakes, glitches, to lose control instead of orchestrating the perfect symphony of cheesy geometries. Specifically, we use video game engines to produce a world in which design and analysis collapsed. If you look at, for instance, Eisman's Notes on Conceptual Architecture, which is an important text for me, and if you just look at the first two illustrations, I actually am deeply interested in the relationship between text and illustrations, and that's another reason why this Schumacher book is deeply problematic. It has like 3 illustrations. But if you just look at those first 2 illustrations, that you are presented with Donald Judd and Saul LeWitt, and those 2 alone just set up a disciplinary space of geometry and methodology and instructions. And for us in the office, we thought, what would happen if you kept the text but you replaced the illustrations, which we actually did. And if you change the illustrations with Sarah and Smithson, you just have an alternate universe to work within, a different disciplinary space, a different sort of object text space with different subjectivities based on material, mass, weight, and entropy. Simultaneous to these experiments, we produce disciplinary maps. I like a lot of I deal with, I make these equations and charts, which are a little crazy, but and discursive narratives in order to locate space to work, for us to work, and to perhaps form some other frequency, collapsing aesthetic and ontological niches into something that's not smooth and an easy relationship. We're not trying to eradicate difference or turn everything into a swarm. I think even the discussion of what difference is a kind of interesting thing to have. We believe that architecture exists in this object narrative, between the object-narrative relationship through a sort of ontological flatness. The products of history, techniques, representation, technology can be mixed, producing new associations, identities, audiences, and constituencies. We believe in an architecture that is in conversation with other architectures. The unification or unifying style would only depoliticize architecture in the end. In Rancière's terms, he divides the world up into police and the political. And one group, the police, says that there's nothing to see here. He says, they always say, move along, nothing to see here. And the political is where you stop to produce a kind of, hey, look at this. What is this? What does that mean? And unification would only produce a police state in the end. So when we say beauty, we mean some kind of coherence, some sort of recognizable value. Any unifying style is an attempt at unifying values and avoiding the risk of discordance. If anything, we hope that our work will not be unifying. We'd be okay to be a momentary reprieve for a small group, think Black Dice, which is a band, which maybe only 2, I don't know how many people get the reference, but anyways, we like them. So there's some work, Exhibit C. I'll just show some of the stuff that Scott was talking about. I was going to show the software, but I don't think there's time. These are done in processing. We use real-time physics engines, video game engines to sort of produce another world of that we can operate within based on physics, that sort of have sort of subjectivities that are simulations of the world here. I was thinking about also when you guys were talking earlier about the beauty of trees, and I was saying I just have never seen a tree I didn't like. And it's the same with these things, which I kind of didn't see one of those I didn't like. These are different things. So this is moss sand. A lot of the projects we do, the software we build in strange ways. So this was a part of a thing called the Creators Project in New York that we traveled around. I don't know if Mike's here, but he worked on it. Some software for nets, grids. We're sort of running them through physics engines to deform. This is the most recent thing we just did in the fall in the Wexner Center for a theater. And half of the projects I've shown, including this one, were with an artist, Tobias Putri, that we worked with. So this is looking at kind of field of points that produce Voronoi cells, but then are weighted down so they all slump, made out of these pieces, and then sprayed with a fireproofing. That's it. Thanks. Should I do my updates now?
Okay, that was really very dense. So first of all, I would like to thank our three speakers. Mario, who reinvented the Gothic. Ingeborg, who did the history of beauty, and I counted something like 12 minutes. And then Michael, who finally introduced a huge nuance of doubt in this whole story. So thank you very much, all of you. Probably I'd like to begin with a general remark, then I'll throw a couple of questions to each of you. The general remark is what struck me is how much the story about parametricism goes with an idea of reconciliation. You know, through parametricism, we could, for example, reconcile rules and variation, series, and individual objects, so that would be wonderful. We would also reconcile the man and the planet, nothing less. You know, and of course, if we go into Schumacher, we reconcile pretty much everything: politics, urbanism, I don't know, French cuisine, and American hamburger. So it's quite amazing. So and I was thinking all of a sudden, what about violence? I was reminded of Rimbaud, who begins the season in hell by saying that he sat beauty on the lap, and then he slapped her face. So what about the violence that goes with beauty? And for me, that's one of the questions in some ways that parametricism tend to raise. You know, we're floating in so much, and I love your cheesy adjective, sometimes some kind of cheesy reconciliation, that it would be interesting to ask oneself, where has the violence of beauty gone in this affair? So that was my general remark. Now we'll begin, you know, by Mario. Since we're both historians, it seems appropriate. So I'll begin by pretend that I believe you on the Gothic, okay? The only thing I have is that we don't know how the Gothic looked at their buildings. So all we have is, for example, a couple of theories about what constituted the beauty of Gothic. We have, for example, Viollet-le-Duc in the 19th century, who says basically the beauty of the Gothic is the beauty of the rule, the beauty of the structure. One could say in modern terms, the beauty of the algorithm. But then, and you know, I was surprised by your Ruskin 2.0, because Ruskin actually says exactly the contrary. What he likes is the variation, the impossibility to understand the individual production of differences through the general algorithm, and it's a kind of anti-Viollet-le-Ducian position. So the question I'd like to ask you, finally, what's this beauty about? Is it the beauty of the script? which you tend to say, saying that we're going to live in such a complex world that we have to understand the deep hidden beauty of the script? Or is it the Ruskinian 2.0, as you say, beauty of the variation? What do we ultimately like in this affair, according to you, that is? So, script, variation, both?
Should I answer now?
Oh, I can, whatever, or I have something in reserve then for Ingeborg, but we can begin by this one.
Well,
And of course, the two others, feel free to disagree. It's part of the idea.
as you notice, as I presume the audience has noticed, I abstained from tackling the core of the assignment which had been given to me.
That's why I'm trying to push you.
I did not go. The topic here was parametricism and beauty. Parametricism, I'm a Philistine, or a Philistine.
I know that.
And I am not a trendy person. I come from an untrendy part of the world. And I speak with an untrendy accent. No one understands what I say anyway. So I can...
We share that. Okay, once you've said that, come to the point.
I do not think we have to go into the depth of the history of philosophy. Our topic today is to try and assess to what extent a technological change is bringing about a feedback loop into our perception of a visual environment. So media can only affect mediation. And I think it is important to realize that parametricism, being a media change, is bringing about a revolution in our perception of the mediation between us and the built environment, generally speaking, a complete change of our scopic regime, which used to be, in the scopic regime, end quote, of modernity, predicated upon the recognition of identical copies. And now it is increasingly predicated upon the replication of variations generated by an inner core of resilient script. This has nothing to do with the Platonic or Aristotelian definition of beauty. This has to do with the filters which necessarily exist between what we perceive and how we perceive. Yeah, I think we can argue that this is changing.
Yeah,
and this is changing in a drastic way.
Oh, sorry, Michael.
I mean, I think, is this thing on? I mean, I think it's incredibly appealing what you're saying, but for me, the question would be illustrations, in a certain sense, like specifics. Give me an example. I mean, because in the abstract sense, parametricism is everything to everybody, like you were saying. It's very malleable, and it sounds fantastic. I want some, give me some. So if I would like to know, though, how it plays out in specific instances in that sense, like in some way in the world, or if it's better as a kind of philosophical construct in that regard.
To go a bit further also, you say that now it's a brand revolution. Okay, but then you've been dealing a lot with Greco-Roman temples and Gothic churches. So let's take the the Parthenon and the Doric column. Are you interested in some ways by the variation and the idea, a kind of dialectic between the variation and the rule? Is that what you're suggesting? Or
let me answer first, second. Mm-hmm. Specific example. And by the way, I do not want to be the speaker here for the protagonist in absentia of our discussion.
I have a musical metaphor for that, which is the opera by Bizet, L'Arlésienne, in which the main character arrives at the end and all the interesting stuff takes place in his absence.
You see, the chair is empty.
Alive, but that's okay.
we could have an epiphany.
Okay, Mario, come on.
Standardized printed icons, which we recognize as such. Trademarks, commercial trademarks, registered icons. If they are not the same, For us, they do not mean the same, or they mean something else, or they mean nothing at all. Antiquity had a way, and the Middle Ages as well, to confer stable signs to stable meanings to unstable signs. The icon of the Roman Empire was the eagle. Empires tend to choose eagles. And when the legions arrived, they had a metal eagle. Some of these eagles still exist in archaeological museums. Go and have a look at them. Find two that are identical. And yet they could have, with metal technology, reproduced them. They didn't. Some look like penguins. Some look like chickens. Some look like turkeys. Sometimes it's not even clear that they are a bird at all. And yet, evidently, when the legions arrived, no one had any doubt. So evidently, signs could change, and there was a consensus to confer the same meaning to signs which were always different, a capacity which we seem to have lost. Because if a trademark is not exactly as it has been copyrighted, it is not protected by law, and legally, and in fact perceptively, it has no longer the same meaning. Think of how many crosses exist in our visual environment, but there is only one which stands for the Swiss Confederation. It is copyrighted. You cannot use it unless the owner of the copyright, and it is a proportional formula. It is an algorithm which determines which one means that. If you change it a little bit, it means médecins sans frontières. So we wanted an example, this one.
No, Mario, I have to disagree. I mean, certainly, yes, there are standardizations, normatizations, which feed into the modernity discussion you're bringing to the table, but we also have types and typology in architecture. And I think those are exactly the counter model to what you just said, because here we have, since ever then, a thought of an umbrella term, which comprises under its terminology, let's say, an infinite amount of hospitals. Right? And they're still understood and comprehended as hospitals without being at exactly the same. So I think what we now hyping so much as being this parametric new novelty and whatever, which is now this mind-blowing thing, has been in architecture all the time. And not necessarily in that literal, let's say, literal flexing as I've shown it today with our towers, but rather in a much broader sense and maybe even a more deep sense.
Why did you design hospitals for Venice then?
I didn't design hospitals. We
She
had
has a
towers.
point. She has a point.
It is a very good point, and I admit this is some streak of parametricism. Parametricism is embedded in our thinking, and it can never disappear completely. Even at the climax, at the zenith, at the...
I have a question for you, Ingeborg, since you took. First, a remark. I think, I don't know whether it's kind of, I don't know, cultural habitus, but you don't like cosmetics, it seems. And let me remind you that cosmetics and cosmos have actually the same origin. So they are something you should take very seriously, appearances. Now...
Okay, I will occur differently from now on.
I had a question for you. Don't you fear that you might be trying to ally, I was struck, and this is something that really strikes me a lot with all these parametricism, etc., that we pass constantly from one regime to another, and these two regimes used to be incompatible. One, which was computation, which was supposed to be totally adverse to the idea of organicism, nature, etc., and throughout history, these things have been dissociated. And then, when you reconcile toward the end of your presentation, Man and the Planet, I'm having kind of a frisson, and wondering, your kind of beauty frightens me a little bit, because we've seen, nature and computation. You're not afraid a little bit by that cocktail?
Yeah, okay. I would normally share your concerns, frankly. Okay,
that's good.
But you can shift it in different ways. I'm not Carl Schue, who thinks our entire being is based on computation. That's not me. But I think we could also think
Still a little bit of makeup.
Yes, I don't have much makeup, a little bit. Okay, back to question is, so if we think about us,
yes,
and I assume you also understand that you will eventually die. right? And I'm not going to be here in a kind of religious little...
I think that feeling, yeah.
You know that you will die? Yeah, okay. You know what will happen to your body? What do you think? It goes into the earth, and then some worms come, some bacteria come, and then Antoine Picon will eventually dissipate.
That's such
into,
a sad loss.
It's very
As
sad.
Nero said,
It is.
I'm appalled
but
by that perspective.
I could imagine, but now, let's say, so we have this Antoine Picon, who also eventually came about as a collection of little atoms and molecules, and then eventually he arrived as being Antoine Picon. And then Antoine Picon, it became a celebrity in the history and theory of architecture and added to the culture a lot of other cultural products. And so now I'm wondering, how much is that cultural production of Antoine Picon possible without Antoine Picon being a collection of atoms and molecules? Now, that is what I'm, let's say, kind of pushing a little bit. Yes, obviously, we have the categories of culture and nature, but I believe culture only exists because we are existing also as natures, and that means we're part of an ecological system. And that doesn't mean that Ingeborg Rocker suddenly turns green or because Moisen likes that. No, I only think this is an interesting philosophical thought.
Okay,
to entertain.
Then I think, oh, by the way, you know that Bossuet, a very famous French 17th century preacher, began once his preach by saying, "Let me open a grave in front of you." So that was brilliant. You reinvented that. Now, since I'm not totally dead yet, I was wondering, first of all, if by the end, if we are into philosophy, if you're not a Stoician by the end, because it looks very much like a kind of Epicurean, a kind of a world of Epicure and so forth, of atoms, etc. So I found that interesting. I still wonder, why are you interested that much? Why does nature, which might relate to the theme we had last year, why does nature matter so much? Or is it nature, or is it the environment?
It's this eco-logic. So, and what it means, it is not really differentiating between culture and nature. It rather understands everything pretty much in a feedback loop. So, and that's. And I know that's not system theory. Maybe it has a flavor of it, but I think it's what it suggests. It's literally suggests a rethinking, as here my neighbor suggested, in terms of subject and object, but very much focus on a production circle. I suggest this in a much broader sense, and it doesn't undo architecture nor its discourses. So we don't need to be afraid. We're still having our department in place, but it rather suggests to entertain it a little bit.
Well, you scared me.
I know I scare you today. You're almost dead, and now the department made you go.
Thank you. Good. So I'll pass probably to Michael to finish, which is the less easy, I must say, to provoke, because basically, you included the provocation, and which is always a good way to avoid. I was critique. So what to say? That was smart, actually. The only thing, all of a sudden, there were two questions I wanted to ask you. The first one, are you really talking about politics or actually about ethics? Because a lot of things you raised were more about a kind of ethics of the designer it took me a while, since I'm not a very native English speaker, to understand all the pun in the 90s noughties. But once I got it, it seemed to me that the difference had more to do with a kind of ethical stand between the two periods in some ways. So that was my first question. Okay. I have the bad one then, which
hit me with
is,
the second one.
I have, of course, to try to find a torrent for the black dice, but until then, since I don't know them, I was a bit perplexed, because after denouncing the cheesy harmony, we're back to music. That scared me as much as nature. So it seems that, when the beauty rises again like the moon after its eclipse, we're back to very old things, nature, harmony, and music.
Black Dice is not harmony and music, I would say.
Okay, that's why I think I have to download it.
Yeah, you have to download it.
Yeah.
It's actually
the question about
I can answer
music versus harmony, etc.
I mean, there's aspects of harmony to it, but it's more experimental. But okay, the first one. What was the first one? I caught on black. Okay, ethics. I mean, I take politics in when I'm using it in a kind of from a Rancière point of view. So it's maybe that's the role of politics I'm looking at, and politics is in a way the space of debate over values, which is part of it's really ethics, but it's also it's very.
Let me take a provocative stance. Let's suppose I'm sympathetic to Ingeborg, not when she makes me die, but we should reconcile man and the planet. Okay, and then you say architecture should only be political using its own.
Okay,
means.
so this is what I would say.
Thinking
I
she's
can argue.
political. You're
Got
ethical.
it. I think for instance we can talk about the Prius.
Yeah.
I mean the Prius is interesting from the point of view of it producing a new aesthetic, which produces a politics, but it doesn't really save the planet. It brings up a point that there's better ecological cars before the Prius. It sort of it became a point that everybody, you had a Prius even, I think, or no? Everybody had a Prius, and the Prius becomes a thing that you can become identified with, and you become known for caring about the planet. It's an aesthetic project that produces a politics around it. And it's not necessarily the best technology. It doesn't actually save the planet, but maybe it would eventually save the planet. But it doesn't necessarily literally do it. And so that would be an example of an architecture operating aesthetically, perhaps, producing new audiences and constituencies through aesthetic project, and making producing in a way, and it also produces a kind of endgame, because at a certain point the Prius, it's bracketed. So I mean, I'm very much less of a kind of religious metaphysic kind of idea of this. The music thing for me is also a way to deal with it as a kind of historical cultural project. You do make me a little nervous when a historian starts to become like metaphysical. So I think, in a way, I mean, you're a historian dealing with a contemporary in a way is kind of an interesting problem for me, and
designers make a complete history of philosophy, and you.
I
know that's fun.
I mean, so
life is difficult.
Yeah, it's not that.
So you haven't answered me yet totally about harmony.
Okay, so black dice is, or there's other examples. I mean, I think that's interesting to think about the space of production as a kind of flattened space. So someone like, this will make you really nervous if I say someone like, which I think has similarities, except it's really about harmony, and black dice isn't. But like Girl Talk, which is an interesting, and I think the guy Greg Gillis, or I don't know exactly, I think he's an incredibly smart, sorry, was a conceptual artist, talks about the idea that the space that he's operating in, he was really interested in the fact that it was all in the same space. So would have hip hop and rap, and then you'd have like kind of indie rock, whatever, and you'd take all that stuff and you'd find some other aesthetic out of it, and in the end, it still produces in a way kind of dance music. I would say Black Dice thinks like this too, but produces more noise. And we're interested in noise deeply. I mean, the problem with it when you're interested in a project of noise, and it's not total noise, it's not like excruciating turn off, it's sort of almost bearable noise, let's say, we're interested in. But the problem is once you do that, it eventually becomes part of the project it becomes absorbed into a kind of thing, and it becomes assimilated, and people can adjust to it.
Do you produce the noise by the algorithm?
I think we produce the noise with
or you just push a little bit.
I mean, for us the let's say the production, or how we think of the production of noise in a way is not that sophisticated. It's like you take things like the parametric, and we use these technologies, and then we think of things that, how do you do the parametric wrong? I mean, these are kind of thought processes in the studio.
Use noise metaphorically.
Well, I mean, the effect
noise in visual fields, right?
Yes, in visual. Yeah. So not literal. I mean, I don't think they sound bad, any of our projects, but the in a kind of visual sense of noise.
But
even conceptual, perhaps, a little bit.
In fact, we are not saying things which are too different from one another. We all agree that if we play parametrically, something inevitably is going to be out of control, because this is the logic of parametricism. If we play parametrically, if we design parametrically, we work with notations which are necessarily incomplete. That is the logic, the technical logic of parametricism. When this is taken for granted, then you may acknowledge that and play with the loss of control, or you may react against that and try to use parametricism with the old form of agency, where we used to be in complete control, which is a lost game, which is a game which is lost from the start, because we never
I think what you're talking about is the style. The parametricism as a style is different than the parametricism you're talking about.
But I have to ask some questions, both of you, because on one hand, noise, for example, in computation, that could be a random number generator, for example, which they used in the 50s and 60s to generate their noise. They thought that that's the only creative act, because the problem of the script is that it's rather too prescriptive than that it is not. So, and the question was, how do you introduce that which usually would associate an art piece as an art piece which has this kind of accidental surplus? Right? That was at least was the problem in the 60s. So Mariam, but you say always it's everything out of control, and I'm kind of wondering about this, whether that's true, because I think it's, let's say, I don't entrust that, because if you write an algorithm straight, and if you don't have any, let's say, any variable which would be accidentally challenging the resultants in the feedback loop, you would not get anything which is not predictable from the get-go.
Wait. Predictable. You predict the scope, the range, and ambit of variations. This is the meaning of parametricism. It means that there is somewhere one parameter which is going to change between A and B. And you may fix the limits, and you decide not to decide what's going to happen within that range of variation. This is the spirit of the game. And this is the spirit of the game whether we want to play it or not. Because at the end of the day, what many of us do is the following. You play that game first, and you leave that range of variation between A and B. End of the part one. Then you leave the room, you come back into the room with another hat, and you play as the user of the system, and you fix the value which you had left free to float. But it is still you. Many of us are doing just that. And they overlay the first station, meaning the designer of the system, with the second station, which is the utilizer of the system. This happens all the time, but it is not the best way to make use of parametricism.
And what if, by the end, the human was the noise of the system, which could be in some way Michael's solution, you know?
We agree.
But I don't know. I don't like to agree. You know, I was thinking, actually, you're trying too hard to have us agreeing, because actually I do not agree completely with your world. I'm sorry.
Well, I can tell you one thing on which we may disagree.
Okay,
I do not think that parametricism is a style.
Oh, yes, but that we all agree on this one.
Pretty
much all agree on this
We agree on that. Okay.
Yeah, that's the only point, I
Rats.
think.
I disagree with Michael on the idea that aesthetics is already political. I think because you said that. And I would like to hear more about it, because I think that's, for me, the key difference between, let's say, what modern, and we had this just with Peter Eisenman and Moneo talking and discussing here, and how far modernism in Germany or Europe, let's say, had a very different flavor, a very different political agenda than what was transferred into the US. So, and I'm still thinking that there has been a different agenda, or it could be a different agenda involved in architecture, and I think lots of people think so. So by reducing it now to any aesthetic is already political, I feel very discomforted.
All aesthetics are political. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a unified politics behind the aesthetics. Like if you're playing Scorpions in Germany and what it means in the US, or something like this, they'll have different, or Rammstein, or one of these kind of things, but they will have very different politics associated with them. And same with modernism. Let's say Mies in America versus Mies in Germany is a kind of different thing. And it's really also, I'm talking about internal to the discipline still. I'm talking about it within this group that we are here, debating these things. Like parametricism for us is going to be, I'm not talking about what my mom thinks about parametricism or something like this. It's like, it's us arguing what isn't that produces the politics. It's not a generalized audience of. It is generalized to some degree, but it's not a huge audience. And so you have to assume at some level, and it may be provincial. I mean, my point of view may be a very provincial point of view. I'm maybe thinking from the East Coast, kind of with a specific kind of pedagogy background, is that you have a certain set of values, and that these things, and a certain knowledge set, that these things are in conversation with. So when I see parametrics, and when I say positivism and expressionism, I'm thinking very specifically of, because of how the way grids work and things like this. You know, you think of Eisman, and you think of, like I said, Mendelssohn in a certain way, or at least Einstein. And you can start to think of how, which I think of as completely philosophical opposites, how they produce a kind of a flattening of the and an eradication of difference, and equivocation. I mean, I think the parametrics produces this unbelievable equivocation of things. And I don't know if it could be good, and it could be horrible. I'm not quite sure yet.
Yeah, but for example, if we go specifically, let's say if we look at Schumacher's urban proposals, right? We could.
Sure.
So they have this myth. First of all, they have a homogeneity, and yet they have at the same time this ongoing differentiation. So what type of society are they made for? So first of all, they don't take at all into account that we have different architects most likely and different developers most likely developing each piece of their work, right? They have an incredible formal articulation already, which makes the scheme working in a way they want it to work. So in a moment there is a digression from that, we may see a difficulty. So, and the question for me is, what type of society is behind that? So is that the ultimate capitalism, where one mega developer goes in and just builds the thing as such, as let's say Rebstock from Peter also was looked at? Or alternatively, is it even, and this is what I've suggested in the log article, is it almost a secret communism where you have this mega regime behind it, which would allow only to have such an urbanism being built?
Your pieces, and I may be wrong.
Technology is implied, because this is a parametric technology, which is in fact used in an old, very stereotyped, very standardized way. This is the new logic.
It's what happens also when you design furniture and then you design the city like you design furniture. Because I think one of the problems that is never raised by Schumacher is, do you have the same parameters and the same type of relation and the same type of modeling at different scale? And that raises another issue, which is, how do we reintroduce scale in parametrics? Because right now it's not there.
The thing I took from also, I agree with scale from from your piece, which I, have my points with, but is that what I liked was this. I thought of it as more of an equivocation of capitalism and communism in a certain sense in those projects. I didn't take it as secretly sneaking in communism, but I'm really interested in the fact that we are bringing in these kind of the politics, and in a way. And what we have for information is still, in the end, one strange aerial shot, a couple, with goopy towers, and yet we're trying to read into it as if this is, if this is communism or capitalist development, and we can't. It's not really clear.
So may I to open to the floor, because I think.
May I just add one line to that?
One line.
One line. Through parametricism, we can produce infinite variation, theoretically, at the same unit cost, theoretically. Who is going to design them all, if they can be infinite? And some, no names mentioned, is saying, I will.
Okay.
Life is too short for that.
That was a nice line. So now, I think it's time.
How do you define infinite?
Questions, reaction.
It's a weird conversation.
Yes.
Something I heard in all of your talks was a kind of continuation of our last series, in fact, The Return of Nature, where all of you were proposing this model of creation very traced on a kind of evolutionary, natural springing up of all these different variations, which, as Michael was suggesting, supposedly none of them look bad because they all look good like trees. And all of you were questioning also the role of authorship. So the idea that a designer would actually consciously create something in the world.
I think also for landscape architects, not all trees look good, to be honest. And so they actually have a value system, an aesthetic sensibility where they can argue over trees. I assume. I don't know if that's true. Maybe someone can help me. Okay. But in a way that I think that those towers, that what is happening is that at a certain point you have to pick. I always hate the question of how do you pick? It says when you do these variations, you pick, and it's important how you pick, and that pick becomes an aesthetic choice, and it's based on. It's not. It's like
yeah, but that was yes, I understand, but that wasn't actually my question.
Yeah,
so my question is this: aren't all of you somewhat getting rid of the very notion of design by getting rid of the idea of an author, even if design is necessarily stilted or necessarily failed, or necessarily fails? Can there really be a design like evolution?
I don't
Just one line. Indeed, this is, in my opinion, the heart of the matter, because the spirit of the game is now that we have to decide, for the reason we just said, but at some point we must decide that someone else will decide. Which is not the notion of design which we have learned at school. This is not the modern humanistic tradition of design. This is something else. But it is not something completely new. It is something which has already existed in the past, except that for us it is very much problematic, because how can a modern industrial or post-industrial environment cope with a devolution of agency?
That said, it's quite striking to see how the prophet of this new age are so obsessed by their ego. We live in a state rather. I find it always very confusing how we live both in a regime in which authorship is becoming problematic and et cetera, and we live at the same time in a period of overinflated egos. And so there is something.
Okay, but you know what? I can only say our team had very authorized what I showed to you today, and there was no accident in that there was a matrix consisting of 25 towers. There was no accident in what type of towers we have chosen to be seen there. So within the range of infinity, this whole myth of continuous variation, there have been very explicit choices we have made. We had made a very clear choice why we chose 5 of those to be then actually materialized. So I think that there is a little bit of a myth here, as much as a myth of this possibility of continuous variation and differentiation, I think, which also is associated now with the authorlessness. So we still authorize the algorithms. We may not authorize the direct explications, but still we make a matter of choice. Now, I am also very, this is why I actually try to be the poet here, or the philosopher, is I was not interested in a discussion whether I liked that or not, and that's a discussion on beauty. I think if we want to call this series beauty, as much as I was discerned about the last series talking about nature and not ever addressing it properly, I am interested in asking what is beauty and how do we choose to want to talk about it. And I'm sorry to say that means to me that we're lifting it from a naive, oh, I like it or I don't like it, I choose it or I don't choose it. So, and that's why I had the discussion I wanted to have today, or that's what I tried to have here. And I think if we do series like that, we really have to tackle the issue, I believe.
Inge, I will respond a little bit also, because I put forward an idea of beauty, very clear at the end, I thought, which is about the unification, the idea of the unification of style, and the idea of unifying values is one of the classic understanding of beauty. I mean, even in, was it Rosencrantz on ugliness, that's how he defines beauty. And if you for us, and like I said, and we can talk about the goal for us is not beauty. And I mean, I'm just throwing that out there as a practitioner and someone who has a horse in the race, let's say, is that as a goal, we might play with kind of aspects of of positivism and things like this a lot. We do, but we always try to, I would say, avoid beauty. So I don't think, as I think is a history of architecture, I actually, in a way, not to drag everybody into it, but anamorphosis, we were talking about, arguing about this earlier, is also one of these ways, historically, as a way to avoid beauty. And those aren't new techniques in the history of architecture. There's a long history of them.
Or you could argue that actually anamorphosis has deeply to do with beauty, because what happens also that beauty in architecture is not a fixed thing. It's a process that goes from illusion to disillusion and vice versa. A little bit, which was what I was trying to suggest to Mario, that perhaps what's happening today is the pleasure and the kind of aesthetics of going back and forth between rule and variation and never stopping on either of the terms. That could be a little bit like anamorphosis. You go from not understanding to not understanding again. And, with this kind of endless vibration, and ultimately what is beauty in architecture but a vibration, a little bit like in music.
May I cite what Inge just said? Making seriousness like that, end quote, is not inevitable. This is one way of playing the game. And in my opinion, it is not the smartest, and it is not the most attuned to what the medium can do. It is playing parametricism with the old idea of agency and authorship in mind, which is probably incompatible with the tool itself. You must make a terrible effort to use the new tools with the old mind.
Yeah, but do you think it's so old? Because if you take the digital world, it's true that part of it is dissolving the individual. It's diffusing it into networks, etc., etc. But part of it is also a constant reconstruction of the self. Take the Facebook page, the website, etc. So what if by the end what was happening was exactly the same? That's to say, part of it is a dissolution of the designer into all kinds of machines, network, hybridity, etc. Part of it is an endless reconstruction of the statue of the commander. But so just to say there again that instead of one thing, we have one thing and its contrary and a kind of vibration from one to the other. Scott, I have a question for you. Until what time do we have?
Well, that is anybody's decision, but I think we can...
Now, you're the boss, so come on. Tell me. Okay, another question? Yeah. Yeah. Matthew.
Thank you. Inge, you were saying earlier something about how you were saying that with computation and the computer as the genius of architecture, there's an eclipse of beauty. Beauty kind of disappears. You were saying that. You were saying at the same time that if the parametric creates new sensory experiences, then there's no eclipse of beauty. That beauty is still there. And so I'm wondering, in your project, there were, a lot of choices made about the way the towers looked, the way we looked at those images, the way they were rendered. And I'm wondering if we didn't create that sensory experience, if they would then be ugly. If we looked at a bunch of screenshots, if that would be an ugly parametric project, or if you didn't put the towers on pedestals, they wouldn't be pretty. And so at the same time, I have to ask Michael, your aesthetic is kind of like a screenshot aesthetic. A lot of your images, either if they aren't a screenshot, you dress them up. You make them kind of look like a screenshot. You have gradient backgrounds. You have translucency applied to fills. You have not a whole lot of line weights, but limited
we have a
line
name for
weights.
our aesthetic.
Yeah, you have
it's
sort of a way of
called the
approaching
rainbow
that. So
vomit.
I guess I'm wondering, is there an aesthetics of representation that particularly suits parametricism well?
Can I? Okay, what I
Do you
try.
think I'm more parametric and you're basically saying I'm more parametric than Inge?
I'm not necessarily saying that. I'm saying, do you think
Himself,
there's an
by the way,
aesthetic?
his team
By
member.
there
the
an
end, we're going
aesthetics
to
that-
give the prize of the best parametric designer of the evening.
So, please. No.
Okay, so what I try to differentiate is, there was, and this is why I unfolded a few of these ideas of beauty. So usually the beauty was associated to the genius artists who would set something forth, like something given by the divine, which was considered being then the beauty. So usually that was set forth by nature, for example. So that was the role of the artist, to tease out of materiality that type of beauty. Okay, so now the question is then, if we no longer have the artist as being the author only, or the author, then you could say, then we do not have anymore that setting force of beauty in the way which usually would associate it as with setting forth beauty, right? So you could say in that moment we have an eclipse because we don't have anymore the artist doing that work. So then I said, well, if the computer though, or any other device of mediation is capable of setting forth something in front of us, and that's where I shift from a beauty discussion to an aesthetic discussion, as meaning aesthetic as a kind of mode of cognition or recognition, not cognition, sensuous recognition. So it's like a realization which happens through your senses or through any type of media device, which allows us to assess reality in a very new modality. So it means you see reality and aspects of reality suddenly different. So, and that's my argument for today, is that computation enables us to do so. As the microscope, for example, enabled us to look at a microscopic reality, which until then wasn't seen by us. So, and I think so I'm not saying there is another new reality, I'm just saying there is a new modality to how we may assess reality. And that, I think, is also what I'm trying to say here in terms of object and subject, that if we have now parametric, so much as Mario keeps pointing out, challenging this normal or the inherited comprehension of how a subject and an object relate to each other in a artistic production or architecture production mode, then I think we could also say that parametric design is a type of new realization of a condition. And that's what I'm arguing for. And that's why I had to turn philosophical tonight.
Well, but, that's fine. That was I had just a question for you. Do you kill or not the author by the end?
Me?
Yes, because, I've heard so many things about authorship tonight. I was wondering, are you still an author by the end?
Yes.
Okay, now you're reassuring me, because another take on beauty could be, have a friend who's writing a book about the body of the architect and architecture, and saying that in some ways, the architecture is always a kind of idealized body of the architect. So if there is no, you can make the case, actually. If there is no author anymore, there is no... And then I'm worried sometimes, but not really. But
what does that say about my body?
May I go back to the...
I'll let you,
Yeah.
Yes, the Gothic metaphor. Someone must have built those cathedrals. We do not know the names.
Oh, we do actually, Mario. As
well,
you
but
know,
you know,
as you know, that's part of the myth that we don't. But
we
actually, we know who built them.
But we know so many of those names that we never know who did what, when, and why.
Come on, that's part of the 19th century official story about cathedral. Today we know, first of all, that the bishops, for example, really were the builders. In many cases, they were the fundraiser, etc., and very often did more than that.
Someone had
we
to
know
pay the
also
bills.
that there were campaigns of buildings, and since they had funding problems, it lasted sometimes a century. But so you had, architects are not eternal.
Yes, but there is no single name associated to each one of those buildings in the way
Pierre
as
de
it's...
Montreuil, and I'm sorry, but okay, we won't
Well,
enter
this
perhaps
is
another question. Yes, and then 1 and 2. Okay.
I think, is this on? Yeah. Perhaps it's not necessarily a subversion of authorship, as it is more of a parametrics is a relieving us of authorship of beauty, and so. I guess my question is directed to the panel. As we are becoming more authors of systems and logics, given this parametric technology, how might we, this is coming off of Mario, your comment of using a new tool with an old mind, of an old concept of authorship or agency, how might we look at architect in the new mind of an author as the designer of systems? In other words, are we relieving our authorship for the sake of creating systems in which the user becomes the author? How can we create environments where yeah, I guess that's the question, where the user is now the architect. And actually, coming off of that, in that sense, why aren't we looking at the end user and the environments as the definitions of the parameters that we're creating?
Was that a question for me?
It's actually
Well,
for everybody coming off.
Very quick.
You're the designer of the three, so.
I need a recap on that. But do you want to? No, you got. So, a new way of thinking. Help me out a little bit here. A new way of thinking as designers. We're using old operating systems to sort of deal with new technology.
An old way of thinking of the architect as the.
Yeah, for designing systems, I got it. But we're using an old way of thinking for new systems. And why don't we take into account? I'm trying to jump to the second part, to the user in these new ways of thinking.
That if we're relinquishing our role as agent or author, why not put?
Oh, the user. Why don't we just produce software and the user makes their own architecture? Because I mean, I can answer that. I mean, I don't believe in.
The question was for me.
Oh yeah, do you want to? Yeah, it's kind of for you more, to some degree. I still believe, like I was saying, I still believe in. There's a difference between, let's say, building and architecture, and the space between the object and text, or narrative and object, is the space of architecture for me, which is maybe a very prosaic, kind of old-fashioned thing to say. It's not just about the act of building, and it's not about making building and construction easier for anybody to do it. It already is like this. I mean, what you're talking about is not the future, it's the present. I mean, people click and their house is built. And it does happen like this. Buildings are built like this already. And that's not architecture to me. I mean, it could be absorbed into architecture. And I'm not saying it has no chance of becoming architecture. I'm saying until we start to really take that seriously and bring that into the kind of social, cultural, intellectual apparatus of people who really care to talk about these things, it will remain outside of architecture. Does that make sense?
I don't know. Mario is going to make sense of it if you want.
Yeah.
And then I'll take a final question, and then Ingeborg try to suggest that we find something funny on which to finish. So please, Ingeborg, try.
I can continue my discussion on molecules.
Yeah, okay. Mario.
It's just a matter of understanding what we mean by end user and by author. Authorship is simply becoming more layered. It has always been the case in the history of architectural design, of course, but it is even more so in the new digital environment. Think of video games. You play a video game, not something which I do, but I have heard stories from people who tell me how it works. I only use ping or pong, as it was called. And inside a video game...
I'll buy you a game for Christmas. It's a promise.
Inside a video game, you are the author of an individual story, which you construct. But your story, the story that you invent, which you offer, is within the environment which has been created for you by the designer of a video game. So there are two stations or two layers of agency: the designer of the system and the utilizer of the system, who offers his or her own game within a preset environment. We might even call these two authors with different names. The first one is probably a real author. The second one is an interactor, playing the game of agency within an environment which is to some extent pre-offered by someone else. This is a metaphor, but if we speak with the people at Autodesk who are developing BIM, which is all about interaction, the end user is not part of their game. They are engineers. They think of contractors, fabricators, technical agents, etc., etc. These people are no longer, they have already even stopped using the term agency. It is too specific for them. They are now discussing leadership, because within this team, someone will lead the decision of someone else. Again, this is not architecture as I studied it at school 20 years ago.
Okay, welcome to Schumacher
40
communist
years ago.
world. I'll take a last question and then we'll wrap up, so to say. Shh. Yes? Question.
It was even worse. We had not only one author of writing scripts, we had multiple authors, and they were not even all in Cambridge, so it went back and forth. It was a pretty messy condition, and that's how we authorized these towers. Does that answer your question?
No, she's asking something else.
Okay. Yes, I think there is not, okay, I consider the team as being the authors, in plural, of the project, if that's the answer. And no, what am I missing, Scott?
If now parametric architecture is a system, be designed.
Is the person who makes the choice.
In the design of the system or in the selection of a particular manifestation?
Yeah, I think it starts with the idea of what you want to do, then within the development of the script, then the constant adjustment of these scripts through multiple people, then the selection of the actual pieces, then the selection of the actual layout of how you present it, then the automation of that layout, and then the choreography of the actual exhibition, and eventually the production of a piece of architecture. So I think it's a multi-layered condition, and that's, I think, what Mario was trying to say, in the sense that authorship is not as easy any longer. And so, I mean, if you look at Mies' drawing, which I saw in the original in Berlin for the one family houses he did, you will be shocked how little or how few drawings he had to present in order to get these built. It's shocking.
Don't be jealous.
I'm so jealous. But again, our problem, I mean, it's our self-chosen problem, right? Who the heck needs these towers? Who needs to produce 450 pages of a book? Nobody.
If I may just, there was an interesting polemics in German literature recently with this young woman who published a book, and then there were entire massive quotation from other books. So she was accused of plagiarism. And one of her arguments was, we're in the digital age and sampling is a form of authorship.
Yeah,
so it's true that today what's happening in some ways is that you can have a form of authorship which is setting the rules of the game, which would be the people who write the script. Another form of authorship which is choosing the right moment to stop the game, which is the picking. Another form which is sampling, and it's true that you see more and more sampling. Don't do it for my final papers, by the way, for those who are in my class. Still not allowed. But this is becoming a common literary practice these days, etc. So I think in some ways what we're arriving at is that authorship is becoming a problem and that you have to make choices. Before that, you have to make choices only in terms of project. Now, the way you want to be an author is also part of the project. And on that, and since we're really nearing the end, I don't know whether you've noticed the profound continuity with last year. Last year we talked at length. This was something about nature, and we almost never spoke about nature. And this year we're going to deal with beauty, trying to eclipse it as much as possible, and discovering through the fine thing with Eclipse is that it allows you to see a lot of other things. So we're going to go on beauty for now another series, hoping that we will discover all kinds of strange animals in the dark. Thank you very much, everyone.